I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and my guest today is Laurence Hillman.
Astrology is not scary, that it is not predictive, it's not fatalistic, it's none of those things that there's a long history. If you study the history of astrology, there's a long history, so know whose history you are reading when you're hearing all these horrible things. There's a long history of the church in astrology where the church was using astrology, then astrology became too powerful and they kicked all the astrologers out. If you really read the history back in 12th century, 6th century, 3rd century of astrology, it's quite interesting. So your response to astrology is not one that you made up. It's one that is coming from a very long history of thinking about astrology that you have somehow absorbed, whoever you are. And so I'm suggesting to you is you don't have to be, have sort of been pre-programmed into that thinking. You have the right as a human being to take a look at it yourself. It is an extremely valuable tool. It's certainly not for everybody, but for some people it's a very, very valuable tool to understand themselves and to understand why things are happening the way they do. I like to sort of paraphrase Nietzsche to say, a man can take any what if he knows why. And if you think about that for a moment, lots of very horrible things happen to us in our lives. I'm very aware of that. I've heard just about every horror that you could imagine in my work. And yet, if we know why, there's a capacity that we then have to hold that what, and as painful as it may be, and put it in perspective, and then we can grow from it. Otherwise, we're just victims.
Born and raised in Zurich, Switzerland, Laurence Hillman began to study astrology at the age of 16, and this has remained his passion for 40 years. He is a full-time professional astrologer, specializing in helping his clients understand their deeper purpose and their life's calling. A force in the ongoing movement to merge astrology with depth psychology, his approach is practical and full of metaphor and Jungian insight. He now lives in St. Louis, Missouri, with his wife and their 2 daughters. Welcome, Laurence.
Hi.
You have written a book called Planets in Play. I first got this book about 10 years ago when you first published it in 2007, and it's taken me all this time to get to St. Louis, and here we are in your office in St. Louis, and I'm thankful to be here. And I wanted to, and you're also the son of James Hillman, the Jungian scholar, but I wanted to ask, first of all, how did you come to your interest in astrology?
Well, my mother was actually very interested, and when I was a teenager at 16, I was bored in school, and it wasn't hard for me to be in school, and my mother was always encouraging me to learn new things. And so we had a family friend whom I'd known since I was a little boy, who used to come and stay with us at times, and he was a professional astrologer. And so she said, why don't you, go and study astrology with him, because she really liked it. So I'm like, whatever, I was 16. And so I got on my little moped and I headed down the hill where we were living and knocked on his door and sat with him. And 10 minutes into my first lesson with him, I had this absolutely clear moment. This is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. It was absolutely crystal clear. And my second thought was, and I will do it full time when I turn 40. Those were the 2 thoughts that came. I remember them like yesterday. And then the rest, and I studied with him for 5 years, very, very carefully, like he would speak, and my English at the time wasn't as good as it is now because I had never lived, in the States. It was in Switzerland. And so
your first language is German?
First language, Swiss German, right?
Swiss German, okay.
Right? And so he would say things that I didn't quite know what they were, but I didn't want to interrupt him, so I took down things phonetically, and then I went home and found out. So I was really, because he'd get into the flow, and I'd write everything down, and I still have all those. And then I'd carefully take my notes and write them out nicely and type them. And so I learned a lot from him for many years, and the rest is history.
Well, and the thing that is really impressive to me about this book is it's an archetypal approach. Mm-hmm. I guess one of the questions is that people ask me when I say, I work with archetypes. What is an archetype, and how are they valuable?
That's a great question. So an archetype to me is an experience, a form, a shape, something that we all recognize. An example I sometimes use is imagine that there is a perfect horse, an absolutely perfect horse. And I'm going back now to Plato's cave. So
right.
There's a perfect horse. And then a veil comes floating down from the heavens and covers the horse. And so it starts to look a little bit different. And when we look at it, Might have to fill in a few pieces because it's not quite as clear as it was before. And veils keep dropping down, and so over eons we then get things like My Little Pony, and we get a workhorse in Poland that's pulling a plow, and we get the notion of a Trojan horse, which is a word for a virus, and we get all these different things, and yet every single person in the whole world understands the hoarseness in whatever the expression is. So the archetype is the core beginning that started all of those different forms of it. And if you take the veils off enough, you get to the archetype. Why it's valuable is because archetypes is one of the very few things in the world that brings every human being together with every other human being. Because every person experiences archetypes. There's a certain, other than, bigger than, even spiritual component to archetypes because they're so universal. And it is something that unites us. So more than ever in these times of division, I think that the language of archetypes is a way to see the core. If I see the archetypes in you and I see the archetypes in me and in the next person, I'm seeing a commonality, and I'm just seeing how that archetype is expressed differently because of your culture and because of your background and history. It's going to be expressed, it's going to express itself differently than mine. But that's the issue. That's how I see it.
And yet there's a deep resonance that is accessible
Exactly.
to all human beings.
Exactly.
Now, is this kind of like the perfect forms, I believe, of the monad of Leibniz, and I think it was Plato that had the perfect forms?
Yes, Plato had them too, but I want to get away from the word perfection. That's too scary. I want to think about. Instead, I want to think about the recognition and that we empathize, sympathize, understand on some deep level when we see these things. So for instance, let's talk about some real archetypes like mother. Everybody recognizes that archetype, and it evokes all kinds of tremendously strong and deep feelings in people, or memories, and it's a whole huge complicated thing. And yet every culture, even though every culture has slightly different variations of the archetype of mother, we still all understand what the mother archetype is. Even if our mother dies in childbirth, we still understand that as a whole or a big open or something.
And it's prominent in every spiritual path.
Exactly. And so then you have the warrior, the trickster, the old wise woman. You have all these different archetypes that exist, and there's lots of them.
But what a wealthy way to get into non-cognitive human experience.
Exactly.
One of the other questions I wrote down here in preparation for this interview is, unfortunately, there are many, many people who look at astrology as what is called a, quote, pseudoscience. Mm-hmm. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I'm very used to that. So astrology, the way, I'm not going to speak for anyone else, I will talk about it the way I see it. Right. Astrology is not a science, it's an art form. There's science behind it there's science behind it in the sense that we're calculating the movements of the planets. And so to me, the art part is what matters. You can't prove it. You can't, even though there's people who would like to prove it and try to get it down to
certainty. We have to have certainty.
And to try to, I'm really not, I think scientism, which is a way of thinking about the world as a scientific truth, and that you can, measure things, and if you can't measure them, they're not real. So I ask a scientist, could you please explain or measure love for me? The things that we all experience. You say, well, that's just a bunch of hormones that are shooting through your body, and therefore, you can define love like that, but I choose not to experience love like that. I would rather think of love as much, much more. And so the same thing for me with astrology. I'm not interested in the astronomy as much as that I need it to draw up my charts, which is the science. But I'm really interested in the meaning of what I'm looking at, which is an artistic understanding. So yes, every reading from different astrologers will be different because they are part of it, and they are in it just as much as the person who is being read for. And by the way, that's true for psychologists and doctors as well. There is no separation, there is no neutrality, there is no science from, if you think of it in those terms, that is objective. And of course now quantum physics has come in and said, yeah, by the way, you are part of the experiment. So the idea that someone can repeat an experiment in a neutral way is really not
fallacious.
True.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting how times increasingly show things that astrology has been talking about for eons.
Yeah. My learning of astrology has been primarily intuitive, to say, okay, well, these people all say this and point here. What's my direct experience of people that I'm reading for? Mm-hmm. And So
my beef with the attack on astrology, which is quite common, and that it's, it's silly and people making fun of it, is that it's really based on having absolutely no clue what it is. Astrology is not what's happening in Cosmo magazine or in the back of a newspaper.
That's right.
That is entertainment, and that has nothing to do with astrology. So I ask people who think it's stupid or whatever, pseudoscience, whatever the label is, to have an experience before they judge it. Like I wouldn't judge something. I have no problem somebody judging it as being silly or pseudoscience, whatever they want to judge it, if they've had an experience. But most people have not who judge it.
So this is about, astrology is about the inner life. Mm-hmm. And isn't it also reflecting an outer life?
Yes, because of the law of correspondence, so that our inner life is reflected by our outer life, but you have much more control over your inner life than your outer life. And so if you want to change your outer life, in my mind, you first change your inner life. Because I've seen plenty of people change their outer life and nothing happens. So they go through, 5 different boyfriends and they're all alcoholics. I've actually seen that. I saw 5 marriages, a woman who married 5 alcoholics. That's changing the outside circumstances.
That's right.
But the same, it was her inner story. When she changed her story and understood what that really meant for her, then she no longer married an alcoholic. So it starts inside.
And so it seems to be a deep way of understanding one's own internal resonances.
Yes.
One of the things that I really like about your book is you bring this metaphor of theater.
Foundationally, I'm really a teacher. And so I've never been able to sit down with a client and read their chart without explaining what I'm doing. I don't want to just throw out facts at them. I want to give them some kind of a context, because most people that I talk to really don't know anything about astrology. And so I find it my responsibility to change some of those attitudes we just talked about. And so I've always had this. I've used all kinds of different metaphors over the years. And one day I came up with a theater one, and it sort of worked and it sort of stuck. And so I think of this inner play of these, and there's others who've used, there's a beautiful quote by Jung, for instance, about, the play within. Many have used that inner drama, these kind of things. And of course Shakespeare's, all the world's a stage is another way to think of it.
That's quite Vedic too.
Right. The idea that we have these different parts that we step into, as Shakespeare says, one man acts out many of them over a lifetime. But to me, it's even more than that. During the day, we go through lots of them. So when we get angry, we step into our Mars. That's the warrior. When we fall in love, we step into our Venus. When we, if we're in the dark alley and somebody holds us up and says, "Give me your wallet," then either the trickster might come out and we try to trick them into not giving the wallet, or the warrior comes out. And then depending on what kind of a warrior you have, you might pick a fight, or you might turn around and run away. And so I'm curious about the practical application of the archetypes in a theatrical way. We can imagine ourselves taking on the role of the warrior to fight in a dark alley, much more than if I say to you, your Mars is in Aries and therefore you're a fighter. That doesn't mean as much.
Yeah, it's kind of disconnected. And speaking of trickster, we have to take a short break. I'm Anthony Wright. I'm your host today on Attunement, and we're talking with my guest, Laurence Hillman, who has written a book called Planets in Play. And how can people contact you, Laurence?
They can go to laurensehillman.com. That's the easiest.
And that's Laurence.
Yes, and they can also go to LAW. I've got them both because people misspell it, right? So laurensehillman.com, however you spell Laurence, and Hillman, of course, is Hillman, so yes.
Great. We'll take a short break and be right back, so stay tuned. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we're talking with my guest, Laurence Hillman, who's written a book called Planets in Play. And before the break, Laurence, you were talking about the way the theater metaphor that you unfold in this book with astrological metaphors, and about making astrology really quite practical. If I'm a novice and I'm coming to my chart for the first time, and how do I read it as my inner landscape?
There's different kinds of people come to me, and from all walks of life. The only thing that they all have in common is they're interested and open to learn more about themselves. And so I have joked and said that, having a reading is like doing 6 months of therapy in an hour. And I have a lot of therapists who sort of, they don't like when I say that, but then I have a lot of therapists as clients, and they all agree. And so it all comes back to, yes, that really is what it is. So because we don't need the history, we don't need the background story. You spend a lot of time in therapy, getting the history and the developmental and why you came to be where you don't need all of that with astrology, because you're looking at an archetypal story that's there. And so the only thing that we're trying to find out is, how are you living that particular story, and is it working for you or not? And if it's not working for you, how do you turn that around and make it useful for you? Here's a practical example, very simple one. So I had a client who had been in psych wards and had been attacked on every possible way you can. I mean, doctors were mean to her, were attacking her, she had been raped, you name it. She had had the worst horrible experiences in her life. She was in her 40s and was totally beaten down and wounded from all this stabbing that had happened to her. Listening to all those words, as an astrologer, would immediately think about Mars, because that's the stabbing and the wounding and the hurting and the rape and all of that, the negative Mars, the negative warrior. And so indeed that was her, that was where the issue was in her chart. And so I gave her a metaphor. And the metaphor was, I said, it sounds to me like all of your life, people have been, it's like people have a spear, and you've been poked with a spear all of your life, and sometimes in your womb, sometimes in your heart, sometimes in your belly, sometimes in your forehead, but you've been poked with this all of your life. And she could really relate to that. I said, this is when Mars is, shall we say, attacking you. But all you need to do is grab this spear and turn it around and wonder what happens then. And he changed her whole focus. She said, God, I wish I'd talked to you 40 years ago. And she started to cry. She was really moved by this, because it was an image that was so simple, and yet that's exactly what's going on. My core philosophy that I live by, I probably said this the first time maybe 25 years ago, is you do the gods or the gods do you. And what I mean with that, I use the word gods because, of course, most of the planets have names of gods. What I mean with that is that she was being done by Mars. She had no idea how to live Mars. Maybe she was told, women don't get angry, women aren't aggressive, women aren't driven, women don't have passion, don't have sexuality. Whatever her story was, we don't care. All I know is that she doesn't know how to do Mars, and so Mars is doing her. So she needs to step into Mars and figure out what a positive Mars is for her, how that would look, which is very specific. And then you have to take that in context with the rest of the chart. And I'm giving you a simple example of a much, much more complex story. Sure. But that's where there's value, because you can see your story on an archetypal level and how you particularly express that archetype, that Mars in this case, the warrior.
And experience that archetype in the way that you, because my mentor, Dr. Wu, said you can either be hanging out in fate or in what he calls heaven's destiny. And it's doing exactly what you're talking about in the Mars context of taking the spear and turning it around. Right. And because you understand about what's going on.
Exactly. And for that you need a certain language, and so right, which is to understand, to have that. It's the reason I started a school last summer in 2016, called hillman-school.com, which is basically a school that teaches archetypes, and I have a 10-week immersion course into the 10 planets, but I don't call them planets there. I just call them archetypes for those who are afraid of planets. The same thing, the way I use them. But you spend a whole week with Mars, and you really immerse yourself into this archetype by reading poetry and listening to music and eating Mars foods and doing Mars exercises and writing about Mars, and really, really becoming, so that you get a way to do these 10 archetypes that are the Lego blocks, if you want, of a person.
Well, and I imagine your clients doing it in this way. What's springing to mind is that people are able to be volitional in their experiencing of the numinous and of the shadow.
Exactly. So it gives you access to yourself, and it gives you an understanding of yourself that is non-judgmental. It's just, okay, this is how I'm put together. Now what am I going to do with it? Which is free will. And sometimes people don't like that. Some people are happier being a victim and just knowing that they can blame somebody or something for all their problems, because actually getting a reading gives you way more responsibility than not having the reading, which is exactly 180 degrees reverse from what most people think. Well, I'll just be told that it's fated this and fated that and I have no choice. It's actually the other way around.
Right.
Once you have this, you have no more excuses.
The thing that is striking to me, there were a couple of people that were quite prominent in the psychology field, and they say, "Oh, we don't believe in astrology," and they were both Scorpio, and they were acting very Scorpionic, and the Scorpio had them.
Right.
So
Right, that's a good example. And of course, you're talking sun signs. I always get very nervous when we're talking about sun signs.
well, it's kind of
because
what
there's
everybody knows.
Right,
so-
exactly, right. No,
but-
you're right. No, you're right.
But
So,
before we began the interview, we came to an agreement about that the North Node is perhaps the most important point in the chart. What is the North Node, and why is it so important?
right, the North Node is a fictional place. It's not a planet. It's where the moon's orbit around the Earth intersects the ecliptic, which is the apparent path of the sun, the way we see the sun move. We think the sun moves through the sky. Of course, we're going around the sun. And those are 2 points. The North Node, when it crosses north goes up over the ecliptic, and South Node when it goes down. And so basically they're 2 points in the sky, and those 2 points show up on your chart as well. And they make a straight line through the middle of the chart. So they come from one side of the circle to the other side of the circle and continue. And I imagine a straight line through those 2 points and through the middle of the chart, and that is a description of what I call a train track that our soul travels on. So I use the metaphor of a train track. This is all written in my first book that I co-wrote, called Alignments: How to Live in Harmony with the Universe. And there I describe in great detail the imagery that goes with that. But yes, it does describe to me what your soul came here to learn. And that is different from your personality, which is what, whose job it is to get you there, if you so choose. But you don't have to. You can be misaligned from your calling, for a long time. But we usually know when we're misaligned, and we usually know when we become aligned. It's those moments of tremendous inner bliss and knowing. And, we get there in different ways. My father in The Soul's Code talks about those kinds of moments. And certainly when I had that moment about I'm going to be an astrologer for the rest of my life, that was certainly one of those moments. And later when I found out about the North Node, of course it's completely shown that is indeed where my calling is to be this healer, astrologer kind of person. So yeah, that's what the North Node is about. It's a description. It's the closest description I can think of in any of the different esoteric, wisdoms that are out there that actually describes your life purpose to you. I don't know of any other one that does that at that level.
Right, right. And you were saying before the interview, it's the house position that's more important than the sign.
Right, I differ here from many, but this is very, very important. What house your North Node falls in is much more important than the sign. The sign is how you live that part of your life, but where you're supposed to be playing is really, really important.
For those of my audience who don't know what we're talking about with planet signs and houses, can you talk to us about how those work in the metaphor?
Yes,
system?
very, very simply. So if we imagine that there's a stage inside of you, whoever you are, and on the stage there are 10 actors moving around the perimeter at different speeds. The slowest one takes 248 years. The fastest one takes 28 days. That's the moon, of course, the fastest one. We all recognize the cycle of the moon, about 28 days from full moon to full moon. So they're all moving all the time, and these actors, at the moment of your birth, I ask them to stand still just for a minute. And I go up above the stage with my camera, I take a photograph, and I plot that onto a piece of paper. That's the circle that is your chart, and there are these 10 symbols showing these 10 planets around the edge somewhere. So those are the actors. Now, like in a real play, I want to know, who's getting along with whom, who's kissing whom, who's slapping whom, who's stabbing whom. And those are called the aspects, or the relationships between them. And you can read that in astrology. So I can tell that this one is fighting that one, and this one is kissing this one, and this one is hiding out from all of them. And that starts to tell a story already. And you start to get a sense of what's going on just by looking at that. Now, the planets are also in signs, which is the backdrop. And the signs to me are the outfits that they're wearing. So, we know that let's take, for instance, the sun, which is, shown as the symbol of the inner sense of self, the ego, the king, the part of us that says, I am, I want. So there are different kinds of kings if you go to Shakespeare or to fairy tales. And so, if there's a King Lear there, or a king sitting in a bathtub who doesn't want to be king playing with rubber duckies, or if there is a king who's a warrior king who's out there, fighting for something, that's going to make a difference in your particular story. So what kind of a king you have, the fact that you have a king is universal. That's the archetype that we just talked about. Yep. But what kind of a king you have, that is going to be shown by how he's dressed. That's how we visually can imagine it. So there's 12 different outfits that this king can wear, because there's 12 signs. And then finally we cut the stage into 12 houses, which are just like slices of a pie. Just imagine 12 segments. And they represent slices of life, areas where things happen. So you can remember the word slice there. And so there's slices that we use anyway. So, even without astrology, like my work, my health, my love life, my money, these kind of things. And so if the king shows up in the area that has to do with work, then you want to be the king at work. You want to be the boss. You want to run things and be a leader. But if the king shows up in your home, the area that's to do with your family and home, you don't care so much about being the leader, but you care a lot about being the one who cuts the turkey on Thanksgiving. You want to be the center of your house, the king of your castle, as we sometimes say.
We're going to have to take another short break. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement. We're here with my guest, Laurence Hillman, who has written a book called Planets in Play. How can people get in touch with you, Laurence?
It's laurencehillman.com.
Okay, great. We'll take a short break and be right back. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we are here with my guest, Laurence Hillman, who has written a book called Planets in Play. And before the break, Laurence, you were talking about the basics of astrology, which are the planets, which are the actors, the houses, which are the slices of life, and the costumes that the actors wear. Mm-hmm. Also, you talk about aspects, and those are relational, harmonious, or tensional.
Right.
And the aspects, and you say in your book that it's important to understand or pay attention to the greatest tension between characters and actors. Talk to us about aspects, which are
right.
relationships.
And actually, I wrote that book, 10 years ago, and I've evolved somewhat since the book that I'm taking it even further than I did in the book then. This notion of the core tension in the chart. So I used to look at the greatest tension between any two characters. So if you have two actors, and the image is like this: if you have a classroom of kids and two kids are sitting in the corner pulling each other's hair out, no matter what else you're trying to teach to anybody, all the focus and attention is going to be there. So wherever we have that greatest inner tension, these two parts of us that are fighting with each other, I want to be this, but I also want to be that, and I'm having this inner struggle about that every minute of my life, there's very little chance for the other parts of me to have anything to say because that's so noisy. So we need to deal with the greatest tension first, I've always said. I'm taking that further now that I actually have developed a way to look at the whole chart as what's the core tension in the chart. It's often reflected in the core tension between two actors, but it's bigger than that. It's almost like I look at two leagues, two teams. So we have, the blue team and the orange team that really want very different things. And there's a way to look at a chart like that is quite powerful. And then you get the core tension that really drives the person. So for instance, very simple example, somebody who has this tremendously strong need to be out and seen in the world, and at the same time there's this tremendous strong need to be private. You could simply say they're both very extroverted and very introverted at the same time. That can astrologically completely and really happen. And so how does that express? Well, this person finds themselves constantly jumping out center stage into the world and saying to everybody, "Hello, everybody, I'm this very, very private person." And I've said that to people, that exact line, and they have burst out crying because they say, this is the tension I've been living with for the last, 30 years, whatever, and no one's ever said it to me like that, but I get that. This is, very difficult. So when you find that, then the question is, okay, well, what do you do with it? And that becomes a therapeutic part of what we do. I'm not a therapist. What I do is therapeutic. It has value for people to think about themselves in a new way that can be healing. And so the way that works is that now we get into the notion of what do you do with the tension, what do you do with the dyad, which is a philosophical question. If it becomes a tug of war, the orange team is fighting, the blue team, you're not going to get very far. You're going to get stuck. It's like a tug of war. Eventually somebody ends up in the dirt, or a whole team ends up in the dirt. It's just not very successful. So this is what I've been working with, for the last decades. And what I do now with it is I say, we can even use Jung's notion of the third, and we can use Jung's notion of the tertiary function. And so I've always known about the third as being an important piece. I do that when I do relationships. I talk about the relationship as a third thing to the couple, and that's how important that is, going from a dyad to a triad in that situation. But the same thing goes for the whole chart. What I mean with that is that I'm looking for something that is created out of those two teams. And the way I practically suggest people do this is I say, figure out who is the team captain of each team. And so if we have a very dreamy team and we have a very aggressive team, let's say a Martial team and a Neptunian team, to speak astrology, then they're very different needs. And there's your orange and your blue team. And so let's say Neptune becomes a team captain of the dreamy team and Mars becomes a dream captain of the Martial team. And then I say, imagine Mars and Neptune going to a sleeping bag and they stay there 9 months and 3 come out. What does the third one look like? That's a visual image, that's imaginal thinking that can be very, very powerful. And to actually make that real, I have a cheat sheet on my website called Keywords for the Planets that's under resources. It's a free download. And it's just a page and you've got keywords for the planets. And so you would then take a word from each of the two. For instance, a word from Mars and a word from Neptune. And then you would write something like, I'll give you an example. Let's think of a martial word and a Neptunian word. I have fierce dreams. Or I dream fiercely. You can start at either end. The shorter you make these, the more powerful. And by the way, when I say them, they don't mean that much. But when a person says them who has that tension, it is an extremely powerful way of getting to the third. And you're now creating now you go to your behaviorist friends and they will tell you, do sticky notes and put them in your world. So you write these things down on your sticky notes, on your screens and on your favorite coffee mug in your rearview mirror. Every time you read these things, something happens because you're no longer stuck in the dyad. You're actually functioning on this sentence that can only exist, by the way, the shorter the better. It can only exist by using both of those sides of you. It's an extremely powerful tool. I've been doing this now for I don't know how many years, but for a while, and it's really very effective.
It's very powerful. It seems like the key to unlock the unconscious and the deep momentums of both of these archetypes.
Right, and most of us, just about everyone I've ever met, has some kind of a dyad within them if we look carefully. And we're pulled into different directions. You get one of being, a dreamer and being very practical. You get the introvert, extrovert. You get the, the peace-loving and very aggressive. You get these different things that we have at the same time. One of the things that people criticize astrology for is they say, well, I got this printout. It's 35 pages long, and it says this, and it says the exact opposite on the next page. I just explained that. That's exactly what it is that we have these opposite things. It's not wrong. It's just that it doesn't tell you in a printout what to do with it, because that's a creative process. That's why I call it art.
And it brings me to another question about retrograde planets and transits, where the planets in the sky touch our natal resonances. And we've just come out of what is called a Mercury retrograde. Talk to us about what is retrograde and why is Mercury retrograde such a conundrum for some folks?
Well, I used to never really pay much attention to Mercury retrograde until a friend of mine wrote a wonderful book. Pythia Pei wrote a book on Mercury retrograde, and she asked me to write a blurb, and I really loved the book, and so I started to pay attention because it made a lot of sense. This is a couple of, decades ago, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's a metaphor. Again, we can't take these things literally. The most important, you use the word resonance, it's a beautiful word because the key understanding of astrology is that it's not causal. It's very difficult for us to think in a-causal terms.
I'm so happy you said that.
Yeah, right. It's very hard for us to think in a-causal terms because it's been drilled into us since the first day of kindergarten that everything is causal. You do this and it causes that. And we are so trained to think that way that we're not able anymore, as we were certainly in other eras of human development, of understanding a term that I really like to use called the quality of time. When we talk about time, we usually speak about quantity.
Yeah.
So we say things like, I have a lot of time, I have little time, 15 minutes is half of 30 minutes. We look at these things on a timeline. But there were also other eras where we understood this idea of the quality of time. We still have that in our language. We say things like, this is not a good day for me, I'm having a good time, a bad time. Those are qualitative statements about time. But the idea that time has different qualities is very, very ancient. You would go and ask an oracle, is this the right time to do X, Y, Z, to start a journey, to build a city, to have a baby, whatever. It would be about, is it the right time? And so tuning into that right time is really what astrology can help you, because it tells you the quality of the time. And so the idea is that you're born into a certain quality of time, and that quality which is at any moment, it's a different quality. And that quality is then with you. You can use the acorn idea from my dad's soul's code. that acorn has within it that time quality and continues to unfold. The story continues to unfold or play out all of your life. Retrograde simply means that symbolically something is happening in the heavens that is asking you to go backwards. And so if we think of resonance again, then that means that within us, as above, so below, it's not causal. The planets aren't doing anything to us. We're not puppets on a string, and when Pluto moves, then it moves my arm. It is a correspondence. It is Jung talks beautifully about synchronicity, and probably the greatest expert on synchronicity out there is Ray Grassi, who wrote expertly on it and really has written beautifully about synchronicity, Signs of the Times, The Waking Dream, are his books that are really excellent on this. And so, this idea of how we then reflect what is happening in the heavens, and the heavens actually reflect us, is the key. So retrograde is just an interesting time for me to pay attention and to go back and rethink everything that starts with a re.
Because Caroline Casey speaks about it as drawing back the string of a bow, to build up this energy, and then when the bow is released, all this potential energy now is, and I can, in a funny way, I can feel it when Mercury goes direct, or recently Uranus went direct, and I can't remember, there's one other one that just recently went direct, and I can kind of feel that psychically if I'm paying attention. You talk about also the journey through the planets, and can you talk a little bit about the importance of the outer planets in a person's life?
So these 7 planets we can see with the naked eye from this, from the Sun through Saturn, and then after that there are 3 new planets that have been discovered since, including Pluto, which is still a planet in astrologers' mind.
And there's a lot of controversy about that with astronomers.
Well, the fact is that 5% of the AU, the astronomical, I forget what AU stands for.
Astronomers Union or something.
Something like that, yeah. 5% of them decided, on their own in the midnight vote that Pluto was no longer a planet, and it's been, as simple as every kindergarten teacher has been quite outraged about that because she had to change her lovely Pluto that was hanging in the ceiling. So I have an article about that if you're interested on my website.
Sure.
About Pluto. The 3 outer ones move very, very slowly and have much more to do with the collective and with what we all experience. Why? Because Uranus in my chart will be the same Uranus almost exactly as everyone who went to grade school with me or was in school with me, because we're all the same age. And so when you have the planets move very slowly within a year, then a whole sort of generation will have the same sort of stories going on. Where there's tension in between the outer planets, that's a generational tension that will manifest, through a whole generation of people. So there's a collective side to it, but there is a very personal expression of this collective energy. And so even though I may have the same Uranus in my chart as my school friends, I still would express it very differently because of the personal planets, meaning the first 7, and how they are more related to to these outer planets, which then again changes very rapidly.
Well, and also the way that, because I'm thinking about what you're speaking is a generational, like the baby boomers or Generation X or the millennials, and they all have different configurations and momentums as a generation. But also where these planets happen to land in our personal houses,
exactly.
How we express that.
Exactly, very important too.
Yeah.
And how they're relating to each other and all that stuff. Yes, so it's a complicated story. A chart is like a fingerprint, and it is as unique as that, and it is a highly complex story. And to really grasp it, it takes probably more than a lifetime. And I've looked at my chart now for 40 years. This year it'll be 40 years, and I probably know half of it on a good day. So you're never done. You're never done. There's always more to discover.
But there's an introduction, and that's part of what's so delightful about you make this, with your book, Planets in Play, you make this very accessible.
Thank you.
We're going to have to take a short break. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we're talking with my guest, Laurence Hillman, who has written a book called Planets in Play. And how can people contact you, Laurence?
At laurensehillman.com.
Great. We'll take a short break and be right back, so stay tuned. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we're talking with my guest, astrologer Laurence Hillman, who has written a book called Planets in Play. Next and last, I wanted to talk with you about what's going on right now. You wrote an article on Donald Trump and the election of 2016. And you speak about this as wild card energy, but what's going on, Laurence?
So a couple of things. First of all, like everyone else, I was completely surprised, and it actually, I've also used the example of Trump as why it is a fallacy to say that we can predict the future, because every single astrologer in their right mind. A friend of mine was at an astrologer conference, and there were 10 astrologers on the stage, and they, in unison, all had their different reasons. The last couple of mountain astrologers had articles, absolutely, definitely, certainly, don't worry, he's not going to get in. There's all these kind of things. So you really can't predict the future. I've been saying that forever. It's been on my website for 20 plus years. No, you cannot predict the future, and those who say you can, this is a good example of why they're wrong. So it's not about predicting the future. That's not what astrology does. It's about a psychological understanding of people. And if you use it as a predictive tool, then good luck. Correct. Good luck. So the first thing about that. So I was very surprised, and basically not because of the astrology forecast. I didn't do one, but I was surprised because of, like everyone else, I was bamboozled by the pollsters, and I think many people were very shocked. So, but what I wrote about is that we can very easily. What I say now to people, almost on a daily basis, is pay attention to the play and not the players. So to me, there is a shift going on in the world. Again, if we look at what's happening in the world as a play, as a large, enormous play, then to me, Trump and his cronies and whoever's in power wherever, are simply players in a much larger play. It takes away a lot of importance from these people. And to me, I am very convinced that if it wasn't Trump, someone else will play that role. Because right now we're at a time where America as a country is going through a complete regeneration of its sense of self. The Pluto in the sky is in opposition to the US sun, and that is, when that happens in a person, it is a re-identification. It's kind of a death and a rebirth. And so to me, what's happening is that the big shift is that the ego, the sense of self that we have held forever since the beginning, that we are number one, that we are the best, that we are the strongest, and this kind of thinking has so dominated America. It's no longer true. I don't know what rank we have in education or in healthcare, and you start listing off all these things, and we're not there yet. We still want to believe that. So someone who comes along and says, hey, we're going to make America great again, we're going to be number one again, is going to win the election, because that's deep down, I think that's much more important even than hating Hillary, than not having a job, than anything else. I think at the deepest level of the psyche of this country is the fear that we become just one of the players, or even less than that, and we have to accept that and recognize that. So he's just a trickster in a way, and a buffoon, and all these kind of things.
With a Gemini sun,
right?
And Leo ascendant,
right? Exactly. Whatever you want him to be, he'll be for his own convenience, because it's all about him. So I'm not really that interested in Trump. I'm worried. I'm afraid of some of the people he's bringing in and all that stuff, and his advisors, of course. And he's got his finger on the button. I'm not stupid. I'm afraid on that level, but I'm also looking at it, which calms me down, as a part of a much bigger transformation, and I want to be part of whatever the regeneration is of this nation that comes out of that. That is, to me, much more important than these 4 years of, if it even is 4 years, of this conservative backlash. It's also that when the world historically is becoming increasingly progressive. Anybody will tell you that. As the world is becoming increasingly progressive, a lot of people have a lot to lose. Michael Moore talks about this brilliantly when he talks about, the 19% of men now are above 35 and white in America, and that's a small number. And they have traditionally held all the power, and so nobody gives up power easily. It's the same with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They don't want to give up the power. They don't want their women to go to school. It's the same idea. It's, if you have a privileged position, a privileged place, you're not going to give up that power easily. And so there are these backlashes. It's as though there's been a dragon out there. When you cut the head off the dragon, which is clearly what everybody sees, that dragon's tail is going to go around and whip and cause all kinds of damage and kill people and be destructive, which is what we're seeing now. That's happening with the extremism of religion, in many parts of the world. It's coming back. But to me, that is the whacking tail, like a whip, of an animal that has already been destroyed. And so we're suffering from that. It's not fun, and it might take a long time. I don't have a timeline for this, But that's, to me, what's happening. We're not going back to some reactionary previous time, because that's historically not possible. But what we have is a fear of all these changes, and those who are in power are afraid of the empowerment and of the what I call the rising of the feminine, which is really the real powerful thing that's happening. That's where the real power is. And as Jean Houston so wisely says, maybe this is the first time in history where men and women can actually be equal, and really equal. And so instead of having this, gender war of who's in power and who's stronger, that we could actually think of this equality notion. But we're not there yet, because there's such a strong reactionary, not wanting to give up power. That's all it's about for me. And so Trump, to me, it's about America going through this change. It would have gone through the change with or without Trump. And it makes a lot of sense to me that we have this sense of death and all the things that we knew about ourselves, the democracy, all these things that we believed in. I remember hearing in 2008 someone on CNN saying, maybe the capitalist banking system just doesn't work. I never thought I would hear that on national television. So, these pillars of reality that we've had, science and medicine and religion and, capitalism, all these things, each one of them, one after the other, in some way is crumbling into, we don't know yet what the new thing is going to be.
But it's a transformation.
Right. Transformation, it means that something new is coming out. Right.
But that's also, one of the problems I think we have in the West is we think death is a one-way deal.
Yep.
It's not, it doesn't take into account this rebirth, which is already emerging. As you're talking about Jean Houston, the unfolding of the feminine. I looked at the word courage in Chinese, and it said to burst forth like a bud. And I think there's some bursting forth that's beginning to happen here.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I'm very hopeful. It's not a fun time to, if we don't even have to go to reincarnation. That's such an esoteric term for a lot of people. You can simply use a story instead, and the story is the story of the phoenix. The phoenix rises out of the ashes.
Yeah.
And it's not fun to be in the fire. That's where we are now. Everything's burning up, and that's difficult and hard. But if you can know that there's a phoenix that rises out of the ashes, or an even more practical, and not even an imagined notion, but the butterfly and the cocoon. The cocoon fights the butterfly's emergence, very much so. And what happens is the butterfly needs to assemble a certain amount of cells. And when those cells are enough, then the butterfly becomes the butterfly. And those cells, I'm not making this up, those cells are called imaginal cells. It's a true biological term, look it up.
Really?
So it's like the imagination, the imaginal has to have enough force, enough, be strong enough to then overcome the old that is no longer, that served its purpose. The worm certainly serves its purpose, but the worm doesn't want to give up its life, of course not. That's what we're seeing. So that's just a different metaphor for the same story. So I'm interested in the emergence of the butterfly. I want to help the butterfly. I want to help the imaginal cells as much as possible. That's how I see my part in the world. But we can all do that, and it all happens every single day. This idea that we're helpless is just not true.
Right.
You create the imaginal cells by being nice to the guy who checks out your groceries. You're being nice to the you're creating. It's the way you treat people and what you put out into the world that ends up being the interplay between us that really is this new emerging something, whatever it may be. Relational relationships, again, that to me is the rising of the feminine.
The liquefaction of the body of the caterpillar is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
exactly.
Well, we're at the end here, and I wanted to ask then one final question. If someone doesn't know anything about astrology and they come upon your book, what would you say is the one important thing for people to know about astrology and archetypes?
That astrology is not scary, that it is not predictive, it's not fatalistic, it's none of those things that there's a long history. If you study the history of astrology, there's a long history. So know, whose history you are reading when you're hearing all these horrible things. There's a long history of the church in astrology where, the church was using astrology, then astrology became too powerful and they kicked all the astrologers out. If you really read the history back in, 12th century, 6th century, 3rd century of astrology, it's quite interesting. So your response to astrology is not one that you made up. It's one that is coming from a very long history of thinking about astrology that you have somehow absorbed, whoever you are. And so I'm suggesting to you is you don't have to be have sort of been pre-programmed into that thinking, you have the right as a human being to take a look at it yourself. It is an extremely valuable tool. It's certainly not for everybody, but for some people it's a very, very valuable tool to understand themselves and to understand why things are happening the way they do. I like to sort of paraphrase Nietzsche to say, a man can take any what if he knows why. And if you think about that for a moment, lots of very horrible things happen to us in our lives. I'm very aware of that. I've heard just about every horror that you could imagine in my work. And yet, if we know why, there's a capacity that we then have to hold that what, and as painful as it may be, and put it in perspective, and then we can grow from it. Otherwise, we're just victims.
Yes. Thank you so much for being with us, Laurence. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And how can people contact you?
Go to laurence.hillman.com and it's all there. And if they want to send me an email, they can do that right there.
Great. Well, I'm Anthony Wright, and I've been your host today on Attunement. And thanks for listening, and see you next time.